Hi guys, I'm Jordan Heaton, and this is my Luke Acts presentation. I want to talk about the history, author, and oldest manuscripts for the books of the Bible, Luke and Acts. And I hope that this is informative and that it is faith strengthening. So moving on to my first slide, I want to first just impress upon you my thesis statement, which is just simply, I hold to the view that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts were written by the Apostle Paul's physician during the first century as historically accurate accounts of the life of Jesus Christ in the early church. So, furthermore, these texts are among the most reliable documents in antiquity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move on. So the purpose of this presentation is to strengthen the faith of my fellow believers by offering strong evidence in support of my conclusion of the Gospel of Acts and the Gospel of Luke and Acts as historical documents, and that they contain some of the greatest authority around the life of Christ and the forming of the early church. So my goal for the end of this presentation is that believers feel encouraged and that doubters would be swayed to reconsider. So what is the evidence as far as why we hold to Luke as a credible manuscript in the Bible and the book of Acts? A number of archaeological and historical and scholarly studies and research has continually validated the authenticity of the literary pieces by Luke, both his Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles from the first century. These literary works may be among some of the most reliable and most widely reproduced written works in the first century and perhaps all of antiquity. So when were they written? This is really the question that we want to ask is, if we're really truly going to believe that this is a true historical account, then we want to have written documents that are going to coincide as closely to the events as possible, so that way they could not possibly be misconstrued by oral communication through time, oral traditions, or being misconstrued by a lack of being an eyewitness and more of urban legend and whatnot. So the earliest verified manuscripts of Luke and Acts from the manuscript being Papyrus 75 and 46 manuscripts. You can Google those yourself if you have any interest to do so. Just put in Papyrus 75 and click search on Google, or Papyrus 46, and it'll give you a plethora of information. Anyway, our oldest manuscripts, they date between 175 and 225 CE, current era. So that's the middle of the 2nd century to the beginning of the 3rd century. And like I said, these manuscripts have links to the 1st century. So I just want to point out that their synoptic nature, the synoptic nature of Luke and its close associations to the other Gospels, Matthew and Mark, makes it strongly correlate with those manuscripts. And we have manuscripts of Mark which bear many of the same stories with less detail, which would insinuate that Mark having less detail and Luke having more detail, that possibly Luke would be an older manuscript. But we have manuscripts of Mark that go all the way back to 90 current era, and that would be the 1st century, well within the lifetime of the first apostles, eyewitnesses of Jesus himself. So this would be contiguous with our biblical account of Paul's missionary journeys, both explained by him in his epistles, which were Romans through Philemon, and also the author of Acts. Furthermore, even the most critical scholars would have to agree that Luke Acts was likely written during the 1st century. There's just a great amount of evidence that would point towards that. So the number of manuscripts that we have, the New Testament is by far the most widely reproduced documented text from the ancient world. The second most widely documented would be the Iliad by Homer from the Greek antiquity, with around only 300 original documents. So the New Testament totally blows us out of the water, with 5,800 complete or fragmented Greek manuscripts, 10,000 of them written in Latin, and 9,300 of them written in various other languages around the region, the Mesopotamian region. So that would mean that well over 20,000 manuscripts of the New Testament have been uncovered by archaeologists and historians. And so this makes the account of the New Testament the most well-documented event in ancient history. So having said that, I just want to point out that our history books consider many events to be fact with far less reliable and widely reproduced records. For so many records to be out there that agree with each other on a consistent basis with so little change, it would seem that these are very, very credible sources by the standards that we use for scholarly research and drawing historical conclusions. So the authenticity of the manuscripts. I want to point out that from the very first century, when Jesus was still alive, to the 21st century that we currently live in, there have been countless critics who have fought tirelessly to poke holes in the New Testament. Namely, in the book of Luke, many critics argued the lack of a historical record for Pontius Pilate, Pontius Pilate being the governor over Judea during the time of Jesus. We all know from the story, Pontius Pilate putting Jesus to death. However, in 1961, archaeologists uncovered a stone plaque reading, "To the divine Augustus Caesar, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, had dedicated this." So that finding right there totally blew that critical analysis of the Gospel of Luke right out of the water, and totally made it a moot argument. So this is just one example among many. But as history has continually showed us, every challenge to the New Testament has been answered by our diligent research of history, archaeology, anthropology, and linguistics. So what does this mean for you? Like, why would I care? So throughout my research, I have continually pointed out how the credibility of Luke and Acts is demonstrated by rigorous critical analysis, and they have stood up to the test. Namely, I went through the historical record. Then I went through the age of the texts. I pointed you to the author, the authorship, the number of manuscripts, and the authenticity. So I hope as a Christian you feel that your faith is strengthened and encouraged by the remarkable accuracy, care, and detail Luke went into in order to accurately record the truth about Jesus Christ and the early church. Furthermore, I hope you feel empowered to repeat the solid testament to any doubters so that they too may be strengthened in faith. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed my video, and thank you for listening. I look forward to your comments. Thank you, and have a blessed semester.